The reading for today is from the book of Matthew, the 26th chapter, beginning at the 36th verse. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, and yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So, could you not stay awake with me an hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up and let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Roger. Well, we are in the fourth week of a 5-week series on discernment and the ways in which we can continue to live and move and grow in the presence of God's reality in life, and looking at some conversations that people in the Bible have had in their process of discerning their own lives. So, for example, we started with Elijah, who, encountering God as sheer silence, realized that the gifts that God had given him, the calls and abilities that he had received, were to be used once again for God's purposes. And in the sheer silence, he was able to look into himself and see what his future held. And then we looked at Moses, who, in encountering the burning bush in this weird stuff, reminds us that when we are in the process of discernment, to pay attention to those things that aren't normal in our lives, those things that are a little weird or a little strange, like a bush that is on fire but is never consumed. And then last week we looked at Job, who in the process of his life of learning about what God is about, realized that it wasn't about whether you get the decision right or wrong, that somehow life is going to happen, but that the presence of God is with us in both the decisions, whether we make them rightly or wrongly. And Job's persistent presence to see that God is there in the midst of his suffering is indeed a testament as we look forward to our future. And today, of course, we get this wonderful story from Jesus' life, perhaps the preeminent story in the Bible of a conversation with God and the discernment that happens as our Lord and Savior is at the Garden of Gethsemane. So the way Matthew tells the story, Jesus went to this place called Gethsemane. And he says it in a way that seems to believe that Jesus has gone there often in order to pray, in order to discern what he is about and who he is to be and what God has asked him to do. And perhaps maybe you have a place where you go to reflect on your life, a place where you go to see what God has for you. You might have your own Gethsemane. So Jesus is going to Gethsemane, and he takes with him some disciples. And in the end, it turns out to be Peter, James, and John. So they sit here. He says, well, I go over there and pray. So he has the disciples there, and then he separates himself. He took with him those three folks. But even before he gets started, that interesting line, he began to be grieved and agitated. And that is that when Jesus goes up to Gethsemane on this night, he's grieving, he's agitated. Now, grieving, of course, is about the process of loss. To grieve means that you have lost something. You dread something. And Jesus, perhaps the most intuitive human who ever lived, can see that whatever has been happening in the last week in Jerusalem is not going to have a happy ending. And there is a grief that is coming to this, an actual loss, that in going up to Gethsemane on this night, there is going to be something taken. But even more so, he's not accepting this calmly. He's agitated and nervous. Almost as if he doesn't know or he can't wait to see how or what is going to happen. What is exactly his future? He knows it doesn't look good, but he can't quite place his fingers, perhaps, around what exactly his future holds. So he says to his disciples, I'm deeply grieved, even to death. In other words, he's hit the point of grief, that point of grief where he might as well be dead. He's so sad. The depression has so hit him in this case that he sees no positive outcome. Remain here, he says, and stay awake with me. So then he goes a little farther after leaving his disciples, and he throws himself on the ground and he prays this prayer. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. I mean, his prayer is basically this: I'm done. I'm at the point of death. But if there's just a chance, just a scintilla, just a smidge, that it is possible that I do not have to go through this, then let it pass. If God, in all your great, grand glory, power, and wisdom, have the ability to save me and spare me from this moment, this grief, this agitation, please, send it my way. And maybe you've prayed a version of that prayer. But, he says, not what I want, but what you want. In other words, as Jesus is praying, he's looking and understanding that this isn't looking good for old Jesus in Nazareth. He's seen the sign of the times. He knows what he's done in Jerusalem over the last week, and he knows the crowds. They're behind him, but the authorities, both Roman and Jewish, are not. It's going to end sooner rather than later. But in spite of that, his prayer is that God's will be done. I know what I want, God. I know I want this cup to pass, but your will is the will that we need to stay focused on. So he prays that prayer. He gets up, an hour later, goes over to the disciples, and they're sleeping. Now, you can't really blame the disciples. I mean, they're there to do whatever Jesus has asked of him to do, and tonight they asked him to go up into the Garden of Gethsemane. But they just had dinner, remember, the Last Supper. And, sometimes you get a little tired after food and you need a nap. Most people have never seen Thanksgiving afternoon. They've slept right through it. So he finds him sleeping. He says to Peter, could you not stay awake with me even 1 hour? Don't you see how momentous this time is? I mean, for Jesus, it's as plain as day. This is it. And for the disciples, it's just another Thursday in Gethsemane. Can't you see it? Jesus says. Stay awake. And I hope that it never happens to you. Stay awake so that you may not come into this time of trial. I know your spirit's willing, but the flesh is apparently weak. So he leaves the disciples and goes back to pray again to make sure that he heard it right and to make sure that maybe God has changed God's mind. And so he prays again, Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. In other words, Jesus is like, I know I'm supposed to drink it, but let me try again. Nevertheless, he persisted. An hour later, he comes back, and the disciples are sleeping again. And this time, he doesn't even bother to wake them. He just goes back to praying. And for the third time, he says, if this cup cannot pass, my Father, unless I drink it, then your will be done. It's interesting that when we get in to discerning God's will for us, how hard it is to give it over to God. I mean, Jesus struggled 3 times to give his life over to God's will. But perhaps God saw something that Jesus could not. Perhaps Jesus was looking at just the disciples and himself and seeing what his future was holding in the next 36 or 48 hours, and it didn't look good. Perhaps God had a grander view. A view that reached out beyond time and space of Gethsemane and Judea in the first century, but indeed transcended the entire cosmos. So that God could see that Jesus needs to drink from this cup. That Jesus is almost impaled to drink from this cup. Because you see, in 2018, in a city called Blair, Nebraska, there's going to be a person named Scott, or Grace, or Lois, or Amy, who's going to need Jesus to drink from that cup. We live in the grace and salvation of Jesus Christ because he listened and was willing to do God's bidding. And the salvation that begins and is enacted on the mountain of Gethsemane that night is the very salvation that you and I continue to cling to, precisely because God's will was done, not the will of Jesus of Nazareth. When we are in the midst of our discernment, it behooves us to understand that our decisions may be beyond making sense. They may not be the things that we want, but we are here because God has placed us here. And we do not just look out for our own future and our own well-being, but we need to continue to look out into the future and provide a resource and a reality for the Christians that are going to come decades and years ahead. We are the people who are planting the seeds for First Lutheran Church 50 years from now, when very few of us in this room will still be around. The discernment that we do has far-reaching ramifications when we understand that we are following the will of God, not our will, not your will. God's will be done. And if, in the midst of your discernment and praying, And that, by the way, is my usual thing. The difference between making a decision and discernment is this. If you haven't prayed about it, it's like a coin flip, it's probably a decision. If you spend hours praying about it, nobody listens to you and everybody falls asleep, you're probably in discernment. When we are discerning, we need to continually test and persist, not for ourselves, but for the future, for the paths as yet untrodden, for the Christians as yet unborn. This is our calling. This is what we are asked to do as disciples and followers of Jesus Christ, to trust in the grace that has been imbued in us in these waters of baptism, and to find ways that that grace can continually live and move, and that we do not hinder it, but rather help share it and spread it to a hungry world, to a thirsty world, to a crying world that seeks the waters of life, the bread of forgiveness, the hope of the resurrection. It is not easy to spend time in discernment. It takes time. It's highly inefficient. And it often is confusing and ambiguous. But when God's will is done, the world is changed. So Jesus, in the midst of his greatest discernment ever, comes back to his disciples yet again, still sleeping, and says, you're still sleeping, still taking rest. Well, time's up. Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Come on, let's go. There's Judas. Discerning God's will does not always lead to life for us, but it does always lead to God's grace and mercy in us, through us, with us, and beyond us into times and lands we might not ever be able to imagine. To discern is to listen to God, and not our will, but God's will.